Welcome to EPG Pathashala. My name is Dugirala Vasanta. I am on the teaching faculty of the Department of Linguistics at Osmania University, Hyderabad. My lecture today is connected to course number 10, module 29 of Neurolinguistics, part of the Psychoneurolinguistics course. The topic is lesion deficit methods. The objective of this lecture is to explain to you the concept of what is this lesion deficit, how did they correlate lesions with deficits, and described one or two language processing models. One is modular and one is connectionist, and then talk about controlled versus automatic processing, as well as online versus offline tasks which are used in neurolinguistic research, and what are the implications of using these tasks for assessing language impairment in various aphasic syndromes which we discussed in earlier modules. The aphasia, dyslexia, dysgraphia, the whole lot of syndromes we discussed. I may not be covering all the syndromes, but the whole idea of how lesion deficit method has been used to understand these various aphasic syndromes. And in doing that, you need to understand this concept of online, offline, or control versus automatic processing. So that's what I'll try to explain to you in this lecture. Lesion method goes back to Paul Broca in 1861. You can see on the screen there's a dark area corresponding to the third frontal convolution, which came to be known as Broca's area. Remember, we discussed this earlier, that this is what this area came to be known as Broca's area because he discovered it based on the autopsy he performed on his patient. So Broca's patient, the picture of the brain with damaged part shown to you in the last picture, there is an arrow pointing out. The picture of the brain with damaged part shown to you in the slide earlier belonged to Broca's patient. I may not be able to pronounce his name properly, Le Bon, something like, he's a French patient. This patient, when he came to Broca, was only able to speak one syllable, that is tan. He would go around saying tan, tan, tan and nothing else. When he died, Broca looked at his brain, he dissected the brain and looked at it and inferred that the damaged area in the left hemisphere, third frontal convolution, Brodmann area 44 and 45 is what is damaged in this patient, and he is the one who could not speak anything other than tan. Therefore, this area is associated with speech production. That's how he concluded. This observation eventually launched this so-called lesion method in the field of neuropsychology. And neuropsychology in the initial years was focused on single case studies. See, we can always talk about lesion in one area of the brain of one patient and deficit in the language of that patient. So, the initial years of research based on lesion deficit method in neuropsychology always reported case studies like the patient of Broca's. But we need to go beyond case studies. There are a lot of problems. I will come to that part later on. But let's pay a little bit more attention to how neuropsychology made use of lesion method. Basically, neuropsychologists, held that loss of or damage to one part of the brain causes some change or behavior in a person. Alright, such changes are reflected in the performance of a given language test. Alright, so this way of thinking gave rise to development of what are known as modular models of language processing. So in modular models, you have one box representing semantics, one representing phonology, input phonology, output phonology, and then of course there are arrows connecting these boxes. But neuropsychology paid more attention to the boxes rather than the arrows. That is, what is happening, how is the information transferred from one to the other they have not paid as much attention to as what is contained in each box. Alright, let's look at one model. On the screen you will see this Ellis and Young 1988 language processing model. Study it carefully. Look at the boxes. You have centrally located box called semantic system, and then you have on top of it you have phonological input lexicon, graphemic input lexicon, and structural description. That is, when you ask a patient to describe, patient or whoever comes to you to describe a picture, you keep on describing it, and that information goes to the semantic system. Suppose you are asked to read, or you are asked to give a name a picture, the spoken word goes into phonological input lexicon and reaches the semantic system. Suppose you are asked to write the name of a word, you write it, then you go into graphemic input lexicon, and then the information goes into semantic system to get to the meaning. Once the meaning is grasped, then contact is made with phonological output lexicon if you have to speak about it, graphemic output lexicon if you have to write about it. This is how modular models of language processing explained different activities connected to language. So you can speaking, writing, describing something, right? So in other words, what they are saying is information goes to semantic system through input lexicons. Once correct meaning representation is grasped, activated, identified, then information goes to output lexicons. Alright, then the word is either spoken or written depending upon what you are asked to do by the experimenter. So then what is this lesion deficit correlation? Based on such understanding about language processing, how is this method working? Basically what they say is, damage to any of these boxes. Suppose centrally located semantic system is damaged. Alright. Now the idea is to prove that in people where semantic system is damaged, they will produce semantic paraphasias. So example of a semantic paraphasia is, they will say finger for toe. Alright. So one body part is mistakenly spoken instead of another body part. Both of them belong to the same semantic field. So this is called semantic paraphasia. And very often they say that you have semantic paraphasias associated with posterior lesions, that is temporal lobe lesions and anomia and things like that. Go back to the other modules to see where we discuss semantic paraphasias. But basically, when semantic system is damaged, you have semantic paraphasias. But if the patient makes errors only in production but not in comprehension, then this method assumes that the problem is confined to output. The patient is able to go search through the semantic system, identify the meaning, but for some problem, from various reasons, is not able to express verbally. So this causes verbal paraphasia. What is the example of a verbal paraphasia? If the patient says "burt" for shirt, then he is substituting "bur" for "sh." So that's a verbal paraphasia. It is at the phonological level. So which means output phonology is affected. Go back to the model I have shown you earlier in the screen. So the output side is affected. That's how it is interpreted. So then you might want to say, what kind of language tests are used to establish this relationship between lesion and deficit? If your focus is on testing the integrity of the semantic system, you will use tests like word picture matching, choosing a odd word out or odd picture out, judging semantic anomaly. These are the 3 examples of testing semantic system. Then phonology, if your interest is in testing phonological module, you would say repeat the word after me, word or non-word, or read this word, or auditory lexical decision. I will give you something in your ear, press this button. If it is a meaningful word in your language, press right side. If it is not meaningful, press left side. Something like that. Auditory lexical decision task is administered like that. So these three examples are for testing phonology module. Then morphosyntax. Suppose your focus is on is morphosyntax intact in this person who has a brain damage, then you use tests like word stem completion, sentence picture matching, judging grammaticality, sentence correction. So these are some of the tests that are used. I want you to note that all the tasks that I have mentioned under semantics, phonology and grammar, morphosyntax, these are all offline tests initially. That is, neuropsychologists were using it not online but offline, meaning it requires participants' attention, but it does not allow the examiner to understand why the patient is giving the response that they gave. That is, examiner has no control. A lot of processing may be taking place in the brain. The participant gives a response, but you don't know exactly what intervened between the time you gave the stimulus and the time the person gave you the response. It's offline testing. Okay. So what are the typical offline tests used in aphasia? You have standardized, they're all standardized. You have Boston Diagnostic Aphasia Examination, it's called BDAE, or you have Cambridge Semantic Battery coming from UK. These are all standard offline tests which in a way dependent upon modular models of language processing. In these tests, very often the examiner keeps track of only accuracy. That is, if you have given so many words, how many words are accurately pronounced or written or whatever. Participants' performance, that is that accuracy performance is correlated with the lesion site, location of which is a, see, the point to be noted is, if suppose a patient makes lots of mistakes in production, they look at some scans and see whether Broca's area is damaged, because you know by now Broca's area is supposedly in charge of production. Wernicke's area is supposedly carrying out comprehension. Now, if production errors are noted in these tests, they go and look if Broca's area is damaged. What is the assumption underlying that? That Broca's area is a area which is fixed in every brain. There is only a particular area and absolutely no deviance. In every single case of Broca's aphasia, only that area is damaged and they all have production errors, which of course in later years turned out not to be true. So in other words, lesion deficit correlations are not as straightforward as neuropsychologists once thought they were. The lesion method in general and offline tests which are based on modular language processing models have limitations, because they assume that discrete anatomical structures, let us call it modules, either semantic module or phonology module, deal with specific cognitive functions. Okay, that is turned out to be wrong. And the other point you have to realize is, you know from the earlier modules, stroke occurs, stroke aphasias happen when there is some damage to middle cerebral artery. It is middle cerebral artery which supplies blood to fronto-temporo-occipital areas, many areas which are involved in language. Now, when that middle cerebral artery, which is so widespread in terms of the cortical areas it is supplying blood, if that is damaged, how are we able to say lesion in one area is producing this deficit? It should, the artery is damaged in many parts, then how can we say that damage to MCA can cause similar behavioral deficits in different patients? There is a problem there, alright. Also, the other assumption of lesion deficit method is intact areas continue to function the way they did before even after the brain damage. Okay, there is this person whose brain is working in a particular way. He incurred a brain damage, high blood pressure, whatever, there is a artery burst, stroke aphasia happened. Then now we are assuming that even after brain damage, unaffected areas are functioning normally. How can we uphold that assumption? It's possible that something has happened because of lesion in one area, the surrounding area can also be affected, right? Okay, let's assume that modules exist. Even if you accept modules exist, they may not lie in the same exact position in everybody. What about that, right? In both normal and brain damaged patients, how can we assume that these so-called modules, semantic module, phonology module, syntax module exist in exactly the same location in every brain? That is another problem. So, lesion method could not explain adequately the question of reorganization of brain functions. After the stroke, 3 months later, some people recover completely. So, how do you explain? If you think you can correlate a given lesion with a given function, what is happening in reorganization, spontaneous recovery, how do you explain? Lesion method cannot explain. So, because of all these limitations, lesion deficit correlation encountered a lot of problems. Meanwhile, as I have explained in other modules, the modular language processing models began to be sidelined. Connectionism came up. We had a separate module on connectionism. So, connectionist models of language processing look at language very differently. Alright. See the figure on the screen next. This is a typical diagram, explaining, the problem with word processing in aphasic patients. Alright. So, it deals with representations which can be onsets or codas which make up syllables, or they can be fully meaningful words, or they even go to higher level lexical semantic representations in the semantic, but they are all interconnected in very intricate way as the lines, the bottom syllable subsyllabic representations are connected to word representations, words are connected to higher level representations. Okay, only thing that connectionist models say is some connections are excitatory, some are inhibitory. So, the weight of excitatory connections will help you to identify the correct word, and you will produce a given word correctly if those connections work in a particular way. So, okay, let me say it a little bit more about connectionist account of language processing, so that we understand what happens in aphasia. First, what happens is the semantic layer is activated, which activates the lemma level representations, which carry the meaning information. They in turn activate the phoneme level or lower phonological phoneme level, form level representations. But in connectionist framework, you have a lot of feedback going back and forth. You get benefit from top down information as well as bottom up information. So, feedback proceeds through different layers of these connections. A burst of activation gets passed on from phoneme level to lemma level, alright, or the other way around also. So, what is the advantage? How do we explain aphasia in this? In the aphasic model based on connectionism, they say a decay can happen due to random noise on each connection, or decreased performance in aphasic patient could result from increased noise or decreased connection strengths, weights, alright. The main point I am stressing here is connectionist models of language processing are paying more attention to processing, not representations, whereas modular models were paying attention to representations. Alright, please go back and read the module called representation versus processing if you have some doubts about what I am saying. What is the proof that connectionism is a better way of explaining language processing in the brain than the modular models like Ellis and Young we discussed earlier. What they have done is, these are all computer based models. The connection is they mostly computer scientists in interaction with linguists and neurologists develop these models. So what they do is, on the computer they artificially lesion certain connections. Lesion means cut off, literally create a lesion by cutting off certain connections, and then see what kind of errors the computer generates, and see whether those mistakes computer makes resemble that patients make, alright. So the lesioning is done by varying or reducing the weights of lexical semantic or lexical phonological connections in the network. So then if your lexical semantic connections are weakened, do you get semantic paraphasias or neologisms which are associated with anomia? Then they will go back and see with anomic patients whether when the damage is whether when the connection to lexical semantic network, those connections are weakened, you get neologisms. When you weaken connections to phonological connections are weakened, you don't get neologisms. That's how they try to correlate it. So major outcome of this research, connectionist models of language processing, what is it that we gained in neurolinguistics? Basically a whole lot of tests which are very different from the standardized aphasia tests like BDAE, WAB, that is Western Aphasia Battery, or Semantic Battery, Cambridge Semantic Battery. Those are all, they drew on modular models. But connectionism gave rise to whole lot of online tests which make a distinction between control processing and automatic processing. Alright. Here I would like to mention, it was developed as early as 1997. It's a battery of tests developed by two researchers called Fries and Tranel. It's called Fries and Tranel Action Knowledge Battery. Alright. This battery has 6 components. There is naming, word picture matching, word attributes, word comparison, picture attributes, picture comparison. Alright. Using an online version of this test, when the participant is in a fMRI scanner, notice I am saying online test with fMRI scanner, they did a huge study involving, initially actually I remember it was more than 200 patients, but they had to eliminate certain patients for some other criteria they did not meet. Ultimately this experiment was conducted with 148 aphasic patients who were required to lie in the scanner and match the word to picture, or word give a response about how good is this word to this concept, or compare these words or attributes of pictures, things like that. I suggest you go back and read from the e-text more description about this particular battery. But the point that I would like to stress here is that the patients were, the researchers were able to locate a left lateralized cortical network that is responsible for lexical conceptual knowledge. That is, when the focus is how is brain processing lexical processing knowledge, especially in relation to action knowledge, they were able to say, based on 148 aphasic patients, they were able to very clearly say that left hemisphere, there is a network. They are not saying Broca's area or anything, but left hemisphere structures network is involved in action knowledge. Now let us move on to, instead of lexical processing, let us move on to syntactic processing. Now the old idea is that syntax is basically processed by left hemisphere frontal lobe structures. Now whether that is true or not we will see, but the typical old fashioned test that was used, offline test that was used is sentence picture matching. See on the screen you will hear a sentence, the bird is hit by the turtle, and there are 4 pictures. Quickly you have to take, if it is, of course this is an offline test originally, but it can be made online by presenting it on the computer, having the participant take the mouse and click on the correct picture. So you will see in these 4 alternatives, there is a turtle is hitting the bird, a turtle is hitting a monkey, monkey is hitting itself, bird is hitting the turtle. But you are supposed to say the bird is hit by the turtle, alright. So in order, you expect Broca's patients who have problem with, say, remember agrammatism. Agrammatism is problem with not being able to manage grammar. So if you are a Broca's patient with agrammatism problem, you will struggle to find out which is the correct, which picture matches this sentence. The bird is hit by the turtle, alright. Now, so basically in the offline test, you simply say who's doing the action, who's hitting, and the patient has to say something, and they will note down whether it's correct or not correct, alright. Or they might say on whom is the action performed, that is who's the object kind of a thing, and you again note down only the correct or incorrect. That is offline testing, where you pay attention only to accuracy of response. But if it is made online, you can also monitor time taken to respond. If you are able to get to the meaning quickly, identify the correct picture which matches the sentence that you heard quickly, it means that your syntactic processing is intact, right? So, online tests, researchers, why we need to make this distinction between offline and online is, researchers have noticed that chance level performance in offline tests, say sentence picture matching test, are not to be interpreted as loss of syntactic knowledge. Earlier, neurolinguists were when they used offline tests, if patients got only 50% correct or 40% correct, they concluded that in these patients syntactic knowledge is gone. There is a damage to syntactic knowledge. Once online tests were developed, they are saying that interpretation need not be correct. Now suppose the same patient does well in online, what does it mean? It may mean that the representation is there, it's intact, but processing is, for some reason the patient is not able to process the available representation. It could be in temporal processing. It's not about where the representation is, whether the representation is intact or not, but the problem could be with processing, right? So, the research on syntactic processing in neurolinguistics using these online and offline methods, what did they conclude? So, basically now what they are saying is, recent researchers are of the opinion that online studies of language processing are needed to gain comprehensive picture of syntactic comprehension of people with aphasia. You can't simply say Wernicke's area is damaged, then therefore comprehension is compromised. You can't quickly reach that conclusion without comparing results based on offline and online tests. Agrammatism, once considered as a disorder of impaired syntactic representations, is now being viewed as a processing disorder involving disturbed timing relations, causing premature disappearance of the trace, alright, syntactic constituents that can affect both production and comprehension. Okay, it's a totally slightly different description of agrammatic syndrome. Agrammatism is now, with the help of online tests, they are able to describe agrammatism in a slightly different way. So ultimately, what is the conclusion about syntactic processing by the brain? Syntactic processing may involve left hemisphere, alright. That is, earlier also they were saying left hemisphere is very important for syntactic processing. Yes, it may involve, but there is no way we can conclude that only frontal lobe and that too only Broca's area is in charge of syntactic processing. That is not correct. The networks are much more wider than what was thought of earlier. And secondly, syntactic processing is engaging left middle temporal gyrus. Further, despite difficulties in syntactic processing, patients are able to process meanings of words when they can draw on pragmatic cues from the context. If suppose the context allows them to interpret the sentence differently, they are able to do it. Alright. So, they can even construct meaning representations that are supported by bilateral medial temporal gyri as envisaged by dual root model. I have discussed the dual root model of language processing in an earlier module. Please go and read that. Alright. So, to also basically in this module, the concept called control versus automatic process, let me just spend another minute explaining, summarizing what are control processes in relation to language. They are intentionally initiated, they are explicit, they are slower and effortful, they are sensitive to stress and fatigue, subject to influence of training, they are controlled by declarative memory, which is more or less associated with left hemisphere temporal lobes. So, many of the original offline tests are based on control processes, but automatic processes on the other hand occur without conscious awareness. So, they are implicit, they are nearly effortless, they are robust, they cannot be trained, they are controlled by procedural memory, which is left hemisphere frontal cortex. So, we need to distinguish between controlled and automatic processes, also to talk about the involvement of different memory systems which influence language. Alright. So, why do we need to make this distinction? Research has shown that even in dementia, automatic processes may continue to function at near normal level when the control processes are impaired. That is, there is a dissociation between automatic processing of language from control processing of language even in dementia. So, the control versus automatic processing draws on different memory systems. So, to understand what is dementia, which memory system is more impaired in dementia, you have to engage with this notion of control versus automatic processing, select appropriate tests and do the testing when you collect data. This brings me to the end of my lecture today. Let me summarize. I invoked Paul Broca in 1861 to tell you that lesion deficit method. He was one of the first person to use lesion deficit method in 1861 by dissecting the brain of his patient and saying that a lesion in the Broca's area in the third frontal convolution in the left hemisphere results in production deficit. I then moved on into how neuropsychology depended on modular models of language processing and made use of tests which are offline, which draw on control processing and did not really succeed in correlating lesions with deficits. Then with rise of connectionism, more online tests got developed. They are able to distinguish language tasks in relation to whether they are tapping automatic processing or control processing. As a result, the correlation of patients' the nature of brain damage with the deficit in performance are much more nuanced these days, and they are not anymore talking about a particular area in the brain being lesioned, a particular behavior being affected. Instead, they are talking about different cortical networks are engaged in a particular function, and there is a lot of interconnectivity between the two hemispheres, and not only between the two hemispheres, but between cortical areas and subcortical areas also, or cortex and cerebellum. So, we have discussed this in earlier modules. Also, you will get more details about individual tests that are mentioned in this module in the e-text and the additional readings I have suggested earlier. So, please go and read, and I hope you have understood the main points. Thank you.